And now for our lunch keynote. 2 years ago, Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob to many of us, was our keynote speaker. I distinctly remember Uncle Bob asking us, why isn't this the software development conference? And today, I see a lack of technical sessions in our program, and I believe we need to do better, and we can do better. And I think Michael will help fill the gap a little bit for us today. Thank you. Just real quick, Michael is a well-known author of the book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And I would be surprised if there's anyone in the audience who hasn't had to deal with legacy code. So with that, please help me give a warm welcome to Mr. Michael Feathers.
So this is a technical keynote, or not. I don't know. I think the reason I was invited here was because of this book. It was just mentioned. I wrote this about 10 years ago now. It doesn't feel like 10 years ago because the problem still persists. I've been spending a lot of time visiting teams around the world and helping them get out of terrible situations with technical debt-ridden code. And it's kind of awkward when you see this happen because we know that there are ways around this. We know that we can refactor, we can basically advance our software development practice, but yet there still is a lot of legacy code out there in the world, right? And it's unnerving to me because there are things we can do about it. The thing that I find fascinating about this, though, is that it feels like the reasons why this is happening are something we haven't really uncovered well enough within the industry. And like I said, it's been 10 years, so I spent a lot of time helping teams with these issues, but then also a lot of time reflecting on how we get there, how these sorts of things happen. There's a parallel development that's happening right now as well, too. As was just mentioned, there's like this push to go and try to get more technical content within this conference. Actually, later this week, I'm going to this other conference, the Agile Alliance Technical Conference in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. This is the first one they've ever had. And it's kind of fascinating because when I first heard about this, I thought, oh no, why are they doing that, right? Agile really started out with some observations by developers, okay, very early on in the 1990s, that basically the way we were developing software back then wasn't really working, right? So the founders of Agile development sat down, tried to go and huddle together and basically gather all their knowledge and figure out ways that they could get business and development to work together in order to go and solve various problems that were endemic to the industry at that point in time. And so the idea really was we would merge together. We would do technical work, we would do business work, we'd go and sort of meld these two things together and become much better at software development. So why are our conferences having this issue right now? Okay? Why are we having this issue where basically the tech people aren't there as often, right? And the business people come, and then we have management talks, we have process talks, we have talks about story mapping, we have talks about testing, but development never really seems to be there at the table. Now, I could be reading too much into this. It could just be because nobody wants to look at this in the middle of lunch, right? You know? And really, let's think about this for a second. If this was a strong tech conference, if this was like half tech, right? How many of you would actually go to the tech sessions? Yeah, that's quite a few, and that's good. But the thing is, it seems like there really is this cultural chasm between business and tech right now, which is kind of disconcerting. And the thing I'm noticing as well, though, is it seems like it's something which is leading to technical debt. It results in missed opportunities for us in software development. And there definitely are things we can do about that. Anybody ever hear this phrase at all? Software is eating the world? Okay. Mark Anderson, back in 2011, he wrote an essay with this title. And it's a great essay. And the thing is, there's nothing that's really happened since then that's really kind of like pushed against that observation that he made. Essentially, most of the high-growth industries that we have today, the high-growth companies, have software at their core. Okay? Somebody came up with a great idea about how to go and use software to go and do something, how to disintermediate something, how to disrupt a particular area, and the answer is software. So you're writing software in order to go and sort of move forward, have high growth, and do fascinating things. The thing is, though, that we really aren't attacking process from this point of view. Okay? We aren't basically seeing how endemic software is to the work that we're doing. And I don't know, I just saw this on Ron Jeffries' blog the other day. It was basically not part of a point he was making, but it was a lead-in to a blog that he had. And it was about how we going to use metrics to measure success in software development. Which ones of these actually have to do with the code itself? Which ones talk about the code? Velocity is about work, right? Iteration burn down, again, it's about the work. Burn up charts, defects in production, yes, technically that is about the code, but it's about a particular quality of the code, okay, whether certain things are working or not. But most of these things really have to do with things which are kind of off to the side of the main thing that we are actually producing when we are doing software development work, which is the code itself. Now, I don't want to go and basically sort of like sound like a complete tech head here and say, oh, you know, this is like more important than anything else in software development. But the fact of the matter is we spend an inordinate amount of time within this industry trying to deny the existence of the code. Okay? We really do. And it's like it's because it's easier to talk about just anything else, just about anything else. And so we end up in this state where we're talking about the things which are like work-oriented and culture, and it's like, you know, I love Jürgen, his keynote this morning about managing for happiness. We talk about cultural relationships, we talk about all these different things. And there's a reason why we were doing this, right? Because back in the 90s, before Agile really first came along, we spent a lot of time really concentrating on the technology. The technology was really seen as the hard bit of software development. And we were really fortunate that some people stood up and said, no, no, it's about people, right? It's about us and how we interact. It's about, if you get those things working, then basically software development becomes much easier. One of my favorite figures within software development is Gerald Weinberg. He's a famous consultant. And a bit older now, he doesn't write quite as much as he did. But, you know, he said that as a consultant, when people bring you in, they always bring you in for a technical problem, but it's always a people problem, right? So that's part of the learning that you do as a consultant, is recognizing that you're going to be dealing with people's relationships. You're going to be dealing with how they interact at work. You're going to be dealing with all these things which basically affect whether they're going to adopt particular skills or not. And so we had to basically have this period of time within the industry. But we're now in this place where it seems like we aren't really paying much attention to the code, right? And it's funny because some of the metaphors that we use in the industry are fascinating, but I feel like they kind of miss the mark a little bit. How many people have done some lean software development, right? Where does lean come from? Toyota production system, all these different things. There's a rich genesis to this, you know, school of thought. But if you think about it for a second, right? Suppose you have widgets coming along an assembly line, like a car, right? You have all these cars coming down on the assembly line. It all becomes about flow. It all becomes about work in progress, all these things. And the thing that's really fascinating, though, is that when you are assembling cars, once they leave the assembly line, they're gone, right? What happens to our code? We live with it forever. And if we don't have visibility into this fact and how the changes, how the decisions we make affect the code, then we end up living with those effects placed back upon us again. And so we need to go and have that visibility into those things. We have to go and basically consider that to be an integral part of what we're doing. So the rest of this talk is going to be really exploring this idea at a deeper level. I think that the way we ended up here is kind of, you use the word fascinating all the time, right? It's fascinating to me. Agile software development started out in the early 90s, middle 90s, with a couple of different problems that were common across a couple of different companies. And the problem really was having bad relationships between business and development, right? The typical thing was for business to be able to say, oh my gosh, these developers, they can't deliver. And so we need help with this. And then the developers would say, you know, we'd love to be able to deliver, but you keep changing your minds, right? So that same story is at the center of both Scrum and extreme programming. And they basically arrived at a very similar way of going and dealing with that story, dealing with that problem. And what they did is they said, okay, well, look, let's go ahead and apply separation of concerns, which is a software engineering tactic, right? So we have business over here and we have development. And what we'll do is we'll basically have them communicate back and forth by features and estimates. And I remember hearing Kent Beck saying in the early days, it's kind of like, you know, as a software developer, I don't really know the business. Business people are paid to know the business. They tell me what they need and I'll do it for them. And they don't know anything about software development, right? So I know about software development. I'll make estimates about how long it takes to do things and give those estimates back to them. And then you have things like the planning game, and you have sprint planning, all these things, which are ways of going and having a nice formal relationship between business and development. Now, of course, things have gotten much looser since the early days of Agile. Okay, we now have product teams where you basically have developers and business people working in and day out to go and sort of like arrive at better solutions. And it took a while for us to get there, but I still feel that we haven't gone far enough. And that we basically have the mark of this early genesis that we had in our software development. One thing I really am fascinated by is when people sometimes find systems principles. Okay, particular systems principles apply sometimes not only in the people realm, also in the technical realm. Have you ever heard of this one at all? The Law of Leaky Abstractions by Joel Spolsky? Okay, some of you technical people may have heard about this. He was talking about something which happens in software development where you have something that you're basically trying to abstract away from. Like say networks, right? You say, okay, I've got a piece of software that needs to communicate across a network, and what I want to do is I want to build an API where basically the users of the API don't need to be aware of the fact that their stuff is going to be transported across the network. And he said that basically this doesn't really work in general because you can't really hide things completely effectively, right? Some point in your software is going to have to be aware of the fact that you're going across a network because there are different failure cases that occur when you go across a network. But it's kind of fascinating about this because this applies to human systems as well. We can look here and we can basically see, look, if the type of communication we have between business and development is in terms of features and estimates, what's missing from this picture? The code, right? And, you know, it's like, I mean, this happens in all systems. The weakest point, or the thing you're not looking at, is quite often the thing which goes and bears the brunt of the effects of other things that you're doing, right? So if we're not paying attention to code quality, and we're not paying attention to design quality, then you know, that's necessarily going to suffer compared to these other two things that we're looking at. We're looking at the features and the estimates. Now, I'm not trying to go and paint this as like a terribly endemic problem within the industry because we are doing better, right? And basically, the original intent within Agile is to basically say the development team is responsible for code quality and design quality, and basically, if they are going and giving you proper estimates, allowing them to go and have the time to refactor and all these things, we never really get ourselves into that, you know, that strange paint in a corner situation where we have so much technical debt that we can't do things effectively. But has that been true over the past 10 years or so? Yes and no. I still visit lots of teams that have terrible technical debt situations, right? And what leads to this in many cases is that developers want to basically please. They want to go and basically give you the features that you want, okay, when you want them, and they'll push it a little bit, right? And then quite often on the business end, it's like we don't quite know exactly whether they're doing all the things they need to do to keep things in the proper shape to go and add new features in and all these things. So the thing is that basically with this stuff not being part of the main line of communication between business and development, we often end up in a real quagmire. So it leads to technical debt, which I like to visualize like this, right? That's a cabin in the woods, right? It's covered by vines. Somebody ever worked in a code base like that? Yeah. This is the thing which is so fascinating to me. We like to think of software as being something which grew out of the mechanical realm because we put it on hardware. But really it's organic and it has all these growth characteristics, right? And we know that as certain things grow, they tend to become a little bit more awkward to deal with. End up being in this situation where it's kind of unmanageable, right? I would hate to go and stay in that cabin and try to figure out where the windows are, for instance, okay? But that's the situation we end up in constantly in software development is that things grow to the point and it's like boiled frog syndrome in a way. It's kind of like it happens slowly over time. And suddenly you realize that basically something was going to take 3 weeks to do 2 years ago now takes a month and a half, right? And nobody's even really aware of that sort of thing happening. It's just basically the progressive addition of features over time, perhaps lack of refactoring, all these different things. So I think it's problematic that in many software development environments, above a certain level, all we see is the work. We just see stories, tasks, features, all these things. And traditionally within software development, we've basically looked at architecture as being the thing which basically goes and deals with these broader issues. But different companies handle architecture in different ways, right? Some have an architecture group, others basically try to make it an emergent effect of all the decisions that teams make. Quite often it isn't really paid attention to as often as, or as much as it needs to be. It's basically deferred, put off to the side next to product decisions, things along those lines. And the thing is that it's just not talked about all that much anymore. So we end up with this, code blindness, right? It becomes the elephant in the living room, that essentially some things make our work harder over time. We're not really aware of what they are. They're not part of the main discourse that we have day to day about our work. So I wonder about this quite often, and I think that one of the things which is really an aspect of this is that there is a bit of a cultural disconnect between software development developers and business people and organizations. It's interesting to notice that when I attend like coaching workshops and people doing planning and people doing all these things, there's so many things that we can finesse in the people realm in order to go and basically achieve better outcomes. Okay, we can basically figure out how to interact with people a bit better. We can figure out how to apply a different trick to do planning in a better way. Lots of things work, and we're really at that point of going and trying to sort of like find better ways of doing things. But code is hard in many cases, right? Anybody who's ever been involved in software development and had to basically spend most of their night going and working on a tough to track down problem realizes that this is really the point at which so many things reach hard limits, right? Some things you can't just kind of like push away. You have to go and deal with them. And then you don't have the easier tacks to go and arrive at better solutions. And you have to go and sort of like, really dig in many cases. And that's a bit of a cultural disconnect. And I think it's kind of one of the things that leads to a bit of a splitting in the community. And it's interesting because some people actually have their foot in both camps in a very strong way. Many people who are in Agile software development now that basically start from the very early days were developers. They now end up having positions in organizations where they're like C-level people or high-level managers. Some of them I know are still coding day to day, right? And they basically are aware, they keep themselves aware of what these concerns happen to be within the technical realm. It's also interesting to notice that most startups start this way too. Many startups do. If you've ever heard of ViaWeb, that's one of the first web applications that was ever made back in the middle 90s by Paul Graham and some of his schoolmates, right? Paul Graham, who went on to become the Y Combinator, the venture capital group. I remember reading a story about their early days going and developing ViaWeb that was sold off to Yahoo at one point in time, and hearing him basically say that he was basically taking support calls and making sales calls and hacking Lisp code with his right hand at the same time, right? So you're sitting there and you're doing both things at once, right? And in early stages of startups, quite often you need to do that sort of thing. You're really, you don't have much staff. You need to basically sort of like try to stretch out and master a bunch of different domains. Or if not master them, at least be aware of them and be aware of where all the edges are. And this still happens to a strong degree within Silicon Valley and some other areas that are startup incubators. I was quite surprised years ago to go to Chicago and work there a bit and realize that their startup culture was quite a bit different. Quite often you had business people who came up with particular ideas, and they would say, oh, well, I've got this great idea, let me find a programmer. And if I can find a programmer, then I can, do this and take over the world, right? But the thing is, it's kind of like that's not quite the same. You don't end up with the same culture as if you started out with somebody who really knows technology and knows a bit of business also. Okay, if you just know business and you don't know tech, it's kind of awkward. It's just like the problem you would encounter with the other thing. A person who knows tech but knows nothing about business is probably going to be lost in the woods, right? So we have been basically doing some things in the industry to go and try to move past this a bit. User interface design, or UX design, I noticed over the past 5 years or so has become a broader discipline, and it deals with a lot of these product decisions that we're used to going and dealing with. But quite often, this really is ending up being a separate community from development as well, right? It's like, these product decisions, quite often, they aren't really the developers going and doing these sorts of things. And they aren't really as intermixed as they need to be. Many organizations will have people work like, here's a product person, here's the UX person, here's a developer. They work as a triad to go and solve problems together, but the disciplines still feel separate, which is kind of awkward. So what I want to do now is basically talk to you about a bunch of different things that you can do in your organizations to go and start to raise awareness of these issues. And it's not just about going and making code better, right? It's not about going and making things sustainable over time. There's also things you can do when you try to go and mix these concerns, business and technology, which help you arrive at opportunities you might not have seen otherwise. But let's talk about a few of them now. So I call this surfacing the presence of technology within higher level discussions within the organization. Like I said, most people don't really have a strong idea of what their code looks like. We want to believe it's a nice picture like this. But beyond that, it's like, there are visual representations we can use to go and show what's going on within the code. Anybody's ever heard of this? Is something called Code City. It's like a tool that you can use to go and basically see complexity of various classes in the system and all these other things. Nice tool. My feeling is it gives us a little bit too much information sometimes. But you can basically have these kinds of representations, these kinds of visualizations, and have communication across your organization about what the health happens to be in the code base. And it's an extremely valuable thing to be able to go in and do. And you might wonder, well, why is that really kind of valuable for us? Well, let's take a look at something. Suppose we have like a rather simple system here. These are all the features we want to go and have in our system, right? So we're doing like kind of point of sale, combination of point of sale and at-home delivery for a grocery store. So seems like a reasonable set of features for a point of sale system. Okay, does it matter what order we take these features in when we're developing? Yeah, it's kind of funny because the story we tell ourselves in Agile is that it doesn't really matter most of the time, right? You can start just about any place, and what you should do is concentrate on the highest business value, right? Concentrate on the things which are going to go and get you to market sooner, the things that your customers need, the things which produce value in your particular domain. But the thing is, if we're missing a view of what we currently have, it's hard to go and trade off and make those decisions in a nice way. So one thing I advocate with teams I work with is to make sure that everybody in product has a view of the architecture. And you'll notice here I'm basically using boxes. I'm not using boxes and lines, right? The interrelationships between these things aren't quite as important as knowing that there is an area of the system which is about pricing. There's an area of the system which is about promotions, one for inventory, one for reconciliation. And each one of these things can be graded by health. We can look at each one of these things and basically assess how easy it will be to add particular features into it. And then what we can do, after grading these things for health, is run them back and forth against each other, right? So I'm wondering how many of you here have had this conversation with developers, or as developers, whether you've had this conversation with business. There's an idea for a feature, and you say, wow, we can do that, but you know what? If we do that now, it's going to get in the way. There's going to be this thing that's going to happen. Essentially, we have a lot of technical debt in this particular area. It's going to make things worse. If you can defer that feature for a month, then we'll be in a better situation. We'll be able to go and add that feature in a nicer way. So have you ever had that conversation at all? Yeah, and it's nice that you can have that conversation. And that conversation requires visibility. But it also kind of runs against the thing that we've commonly thought of within Agile, of saying that we can just do things at any time and it should have no consequence. These things do have consequences. You know, we do have different health in different areas of the system. And it's valuable for us to be aware of that. And also, to be able to take these grades of health that we have for various aspects of the system and make sure the business knows about these things over time. Right? You know, years ago, and it still happens to some degree in many Agile shops, you'll be in the situation where you say, wow, I just want to like have a refactoring sprint, right? Because I know that things are really tough right now, and I'd really like to be able to go and take a full sprint to go and refactor this area, and once we do that, then everything's going to be a bit better. We're going to be able to go and add the features that we want to add and all these other things. And historically in Agile, we've said that that's a rather bad idea, right? And I tend to agree that's a rather bad idea in most cases. But the thing that's really kind of fascinating is that usually when that conversation comes up, somebody in business goes and says, what's going on? I can't believe you're asking for that. Haven't you been tending the system? Haven't you been taking care of it? Why is this happening now, right? So it becomes this really awkward conversation. But imagine it going another way. Another way this can go is if basically the business is seeing grades of health for these different areas of code every week, right? And they're seeing what the impact of feature selection is having upon those areas of code. Then none of this is a surprise, right? And it's very easy for you to go and talk to business as a developer and say, look, you know, accepting a gift card that goes and affects pricing and reconciliation, right? And so we know we have some issues with reconciliation right now. What if you pick up split charge right this week, and then we'll deal with accepting gift cards next week, right? Having those kinds of conversation. Or push comes to shove and they say, no, for the business, we need to go and accept gift card right now. And you can say, okay, yeah, but that's going to, you know, it's going to make some things rough in the system. They'll be able to see through the health grades for the system what the impact is. And then business becomes a part owner of the situation. And this is a little bit scary for developers, right? Because we're scared of micromanagement. We're kind of scared that, you know, if we raise the visibility of all these things, we might get into the situation where business starts trying to make technical decisions for us. And I don't think that's something we have to be quite so scared of. Essentially, software is an investment like everything else, right? The things that we do in software, they have to be for the longer term. And if we're doing things which basically impact our longer term thinking, at least it has to be visible. It has to be visible within the organization that we're making those trade-offs, we're making them consciously. What's happening with technical debt today quite often is that it sneaks up on us. And it slowly increases costs until the point where we can't really do very much. So that's one thing. Conway's law, People here have heard of Conway's Law, right? I think that we're really at the cusp of going and digging into this much deeper than we have in the industry. I think one of the most apparent ramifications of Conway's Law, one of the most apparent effects that we've seen within the industry is the advent of microservices and the recognition that we can have like these two pizza teams that work on services and do these various things, that we have a benefit to going and having this focused concentration in a particular area of code. And that we want to go and basically have team structure align with code structure. And that's pretty powerful. But the thing is, there's so many other things we can do along the lines of this. But it really does depend upon us having visibility into the system and knowing what the organizational impacts happen to be, right? So a typical thing with this, people have for ages been talking about, should we have particular domain teams, like have all our front-end developers in one team, or spread our front-end developers among these separate teams that have these areas that they're working on, they all need a bit of front-end work, right? I'm sure you've had these conversations back and forth about which is the right way. Well, which is the right way, right? I don't think there's any one right way. What we need to do is basically be aware of what the effects are. So one client I'm working with now, we're in a situation where they're trying to make these decisions. I said, okay, start out with your team of front-end developers working by themselves and interacting with the teams that need to go and basically have their code. And start that way, and then basically after a while move those front-end developers into the separate teams. Why would that be useful? Well, according to Conway's Law, we're going to end up having an API or a separation between that front-end code and the back end if we sort of separate these people off into a separate team. So the cultural difference and quite often the geographic difference will go and form a separation layer within the code. And we can use that as a nice effect. We can also use that as a time for these people to bond together. And then basically once we have that kind of separation in place, then moving them off into separate teams might be a thing we want to do for a period of time. But we can always revisit that conversation. We can always revisit that allocation of people across the industry. But the thing is, it really comes down to going and having this deep understanding of how our organization affects the software that we're working on. And I don't think I really have time today to go deeply into it, but there are so many corollaries to Conway's Law, so many things that, that come up when you start noticing how little process changes and things like that impact the structure of the software that you have and its quality. Another thing that teams can do, I call this direction mapping. I'm sure some of you have big legacy code bases, right? It's like a very typical thing in the industry. We often can have a sense of what the architecture is. We know what areas of code are difficult to deal with. And we kind of like take that knowledge, we kind of just sort of like hold on to it and make decisions slowly because you can't do anything in one fell swoop in a large existing code base. You can't just sort of like go in there and like fix one particular thing all that often. But what you can do is you can basically do enough analysis across your code base to be able to decide what you should do when you enter those areas of code, right? You may have one particular area of your system that you don't really modify more than once every 2 months, for instance. But the thing is, you can basically make an assessment as a team about what its quality is and how we should basically address change in that particular area. And it could be that maybe we have like one area that has like all these God classes and really tangled dependencies, and we're making a decision now to kind of like move off to the side and create new classes, create like a new abstraction around these particular things. And knowing what those things are and how we should engage the code every time we go and come up against it is a pretty powerful thing going forward with things. But again, it comes down to going and taking the software seriously and not just being an issue of like, here's what we do to get these current features in, and then next features, next features, next features. No, we have to have long-term plans for the code base. Feature assessment is essentially what I was showing you a little bit earlier. You have all these features. You're assessing them against the quality of the code in the different areas and deciding when you want to go and have particular features and when you don't. Has anyone ever rejected a feature in software development? Yeah, it doesn't come up as often as I hope, right? And I think this is really a fascinating thing in the industry, is that because of this separation we quite often have between business and development, we get into this state where we feel like, it's like developers' job is really to go and serve the business. The business knows business better than we do. And even when you have very integrated teams, there's this sense that I'm just a technologist. So I can't really go and say, well, you shouldn't do that, right? But the thing is, people in business quite often aren't in the situation of understanding what the long-term effects of particular features will be in a code base, right? You can basically get a sense as a business person sometimes about the logistical complication of adding in a particular feature. But without the vision of how that actually impacts the code and the way that it's implemented, you may not go and see enough of the long-term effects to be able to go and say, wow, I know we can make money that way, but maybe we shouldn't, right? Maybe there's another way of making money that basically doesn't impact our long-term structure in bad ways. So I think that going forward, if we get into this state where people can have these conversations a bit more freely, and recognize that there's a lot that can be done in this area, you will probably see this more and more often. Companies deciding to reject particular features, not because of what they would do in their business, but because of the long-term consequences technically within their organization. And again, mature organizations do this kind of thing routinely, but I don't think we do it at a fine-grained enough level within the industry. Here's a simple one, adding tech to retros. Many people do sprint retrospectives here. How many people ever have a conversation, well, we added this feature in this way, and I don't really like the way I left that class. Maybe the next time we go through, we're going to modify that class in this particular way. Ever have that conversation in retro? Not as often. And why doesn't that happen? I think it comes back to that first slide I had here showing all that code, right? It's like we don't want to, as developers, we don't want to go and sort of like pollute or basically bog down retros with technical concerns, because our understanding is that within the team, the technology is something we have under control, right? But we need to at least have a venue with this to go and understand that it's not just a matter of the features, it's a matter of what we've done in the code that's going to be beneficial over time or not so beneficial over time. Those deserve airing, those deserve conversation. And here's another one which is kind of fascinating, feature discovery. So you're working on a team, you have particular features that are coming in, you have particular things that are happening, and you may be surprised to go and ask some of the technologists on your team, some of the developers, well, looking at the code the way that you do you see anything which might be valuable to do that would earn us money, right, or produce value in our market, right? And quite often a developer may not have the full context to be able to go and give you a terribly incisive, like, this is the way that we can go and move forward in a great way, and we go and we get all these new customers by doing this particular thing. But the thing is, they know what's easy and they know what's hard in the code, right? And even if they have incomplete domain knowledge, asking is okay, right? Say, based upon what you see in the system, do you see any opportunities that we're missing here, right? And sometimes people in technology do, Sometimes they're completely off the mark because they don't have enough of the context, right? It can happen. So this is a practice that you can basically apply, across teams as well. It's like just, let's go ahead and take a day and sort of like ask ourselves, what could we do in a week that would basically go ahead and give us more customer engagement, give us more value, all these other things, but just going and sort of spelunking through the code to figure out what's easy to do, right? I think it's Apollo 13. Everybody ever see that movie, Apollo 13, where basically they had the capsule, and it's like they were about to run out of oxygen, and they have this one guy goes and dumps all the stuff on the table and says, this is all the stuff we've got on the capsule. From this, we need to go and extend the oxygen supply by a certain number of hours. And so they worked and worked and worked and worked and worked to figure out what they could do based upon what they had, right? But we hardly ever do that kind of thing in our development, to do that spelunking expedition, to go and ask ourselves, what's easy in the code, right? Maybe there are things that we can do here that will give us value that, we just wouldn't have thought of otherwise, right? So there's a lot of mining we can do in that particular area to go and do things. And here's another one as well. I think we're going to see more and more of this over time, and we are seeing it in some well-developed teams, where product decisions are being made by everybody on the team, right? It's not just a matter of product owner, okay? Number of teams I've been seeing recently, it's kind of like, somebody comes in with a goal. This is the goal, and then basically you guys decide the features to go and figure out how we're going to achieve this goal. And it becomes a very integrated process within a team, right? And you may still have like that historical role separation that I'm a product person, or I'm a developer, or I'm a UX person. But you should collaborate at a very deep level, in order to go and sort of make these decisions. Here's an interesting one. Imagine being on a team where everybody codes. It's kind of funny about that, right? How many people here write code routinely? Yeah, a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people who may not routinely write code. Maybe they don't have a background in writing code. But the thing is, it's like, it's like anything else. There's easy aspects, there's hard aspects. I think everybody in a software development organization, especially as software is eating the world, should know a bit about coding. They should know a bit to be able to sit down as, say, a product person with a developer and be able to go and sort of like contribute a little bit and understand what things are. And it's not just a matter of going and sort of like getting the literacy in code, but also basically literacy in how decisions compound over time, right? Literacy in what technical debt happens to be, all these things. You can get firsthand experience of this sort of thing. And frankly, if you want to go further with this, there are some organizations. There's one, Unruly Media in London, and it's kind of fascinating because in their teams, they have people who are writing code as well as doing market analysis, market research, all these other things. It's kind of like the other end of the whole DevOps thing, right? It's the other end of like support your code in production, right? It's like support all the decisions that lead into you writing that particular piece of code. And I remember talking to somebody at this organization, and they were saying, well, it's kind of interesting. We have really adopted this model. Over time, we found that it kind of works for us. And some of the people that are kind of key in this organization came from some very early extreme programming teams in London. So they have a long, long history in Agile. But the story I kind of heard is it's kind of hard to hire people sometimes because it's like somebody coming into the organization says, well, I just want to be a QA person, or I just want to be a developer. They don't really want to go and sort of like explore all these other domains. But the thing is, it's like we've noticed over and over again in software development that basically it's the handoff that kills us, right? Handoff between one group and another. So if we can basically straddle the line a bit and basically have skills in two areas, then we have more integrated knowledge. We can make better decisions going forward with things. So I've been kind of like calling this full spectrum development a bit, right? Essentially that if you are doing software development, you should know a bit about marketing. You should know a bit about accounting. You should know a bit about the domain that you're working in. You should know a bit about writing code, a bit about operations, about all these things. Not everybody's going to want to go there in most organizations, right? But I think that there are advantages for organizations that do choose to go in these directions, right? Provided they can actually find people who want to go and do this kind of thing. In one organization, they said, yeah, we're having trouble hiring people that want to do this sort of thing. And I said, well, what if you hire these people and say, hey, stay with us for 2 years, you'll be ready to do your own startup? Because essentially you've seen all aspects of business. Because we have not really assumed that you are a QA person. We've not assumed that you're a business analyst. We've not assumed you're a developer. We've assumed that you're a person who learns, right? And a person who learns can basically pick up enough of each of these pieces to be able to go and see them all the way across the span and be able to be a contributor that way. Now, again, not everybody's going to want to do this sort of thing, but funny, I was talking to a friend in the industry, and she was saying that when she hires, she likes to hire people with 2 strong domains, right? And she just finds that as you hire more of these people, you have these relationships where basically it's like people fit together in a particular way where there's less and less miscommunication across the organization because there's these areas of overlapping domain. Another thing as well, dynamic reteaming, okay? Is forming a team hard? We have made that assumption for decades in this industry, right? Well, you can tell I've got my gray hair, so I've been around for a while in the industry. At one point in time in the industry, we made the assumption that integration was hard. Integrating code was very hard, so we decided not to do it very often, right? Once every week, you basically integrate your code into the main line. That's about it. And in the early days of Agile, we kind of recognized that, wow, if something seems like it's very hard, you just need to do it more frequently until you basically make it easy for yourself. There's a skill to going and doing this particular thing. And I noticed that across my time in the industry, I spent a lot of time working as a consultant. And as a consultant, you have to basically step into a different organization every couple of weeks or so and basically get along with people there, learn how to work with them, and essentially become part of a team, right? There's no reason why we can't do this sort of thing within current software development organizations, right? Essentially, you can have an organization where everybody becomes skilled at reteaming. They become skilled at this practice of like, okay, we have a group of like 5 to 10 people. We need this group to go and do this particular thing. Get together and work on this particular thing. And there are practices around this that can be helpful. There's a woman in the industry, Heidi Helfand, who's basically working on more work around this, some things that she's developed at the company she's working with. And you might look at this and say, well, gee, why is this important? Why would we really care to go and reform teams all the time? But it comes down to this key thing that I'm kind of alluding to, but I haven't really stated outright yet. In a software development organization, the code is real, and we don't get to basically hide it under the rug anymore. What we need to be able to do is basically be aware of what it needs and tend it, right? And different areas of code are going to need different skill sets at different times. And for that reason, we need to be able to go and organize and galvanize the people to go and work on those particular areas at different times. And then if the code needs something else, then different people go in different areas and work on different things. None of this is basically static. It's all very fluid. And if you have the ability to go and reteam, then you're able to go and do this sort of thing consistently. So paying attention to what the software needs. And it's not just the software also, okay? It's really also what do you need in your organization in terms of skill, right? One team I work with, they have a skills board where basically they sort of show all the different skill areas that different developers and different QA people have developed over time, and you can basically see who knows this area and who doesn't know this area. And there's kind of like a salient thing there that, yeah, over time, you should be picking up more skill areas. But within the organization, even if it happens emergently, fine. If it doesn't happen emergently, having some awareness of what the skill set is across the organization and be able to go and say, wow, Kelly, it's like it'd be great if you were over here for a period of time because this area really needs it. And Kelly can say, yeah, sure, I'll go over there for a while because I kind of know. And then she gets to work with a bunch of other people who go and start getting some of her skill, and then they get skills on the board, and you move forward with things. So it's completely dynamic. It's completely active. Okay? Another thing. I'm calling this feature deletion, but I don't want to call it that. I really want to call it code deletion, but we're not there yet, right? How many people have found cases where you can delete features in production? It happens sometimes, but usually it's a very integrated decision has to happen between business and technology, right? You have to go and look at this and say, is it easy to excise this particular thing? Are we happy giving up these customers or transitioning them to another aspect of the system? We don't do this sort of thing often enough. And I think the thing which is rough is that there really is a carrying cost to code, right? And it's not just the code. There's a carrying cost to support for particular features, and we're never really aware of the total cost of these things. And if we were, we might make some different decisions, okay? We don't really have an active culture within software development right now of deleting code. If you talk to people in the industry who've been around for a while, they say, oh, one of the things I love most is to delete code. And it's like, I feel good about that too as a developer. Because quite often, the code you want to delete, you discover that you've been tripping over it for years. It's kind of like it occludes your view of the system because the assumption is that it's really valuable, that it's really necessary, and it may not be valuable or necessary. And if you can actually go ahead and delete it, you're better off. You make the system simpler, and we really should strive towards having simpler systems. So yeah, it'd be great to go and see more energy around this particular thing, but first steps first, you need to have awareness of the code, right? Okay, feature decisions, yeah, it's kind of easy. You can say, yeah, not so many people are using this particular thing, but the carrying cost of the code is the vital thing. Noticing that your system could be much easier, and actually some of the features that you want to go and add in later would be easier to add in if this particular feature wasn't there. If you are aware of what those costs are, then you can make the trade-off. Without being aware, you can't really make the trade-off. Okay? So I kind of started talking about this when I was talking about dynamic reteaming, rotating. It's a nice thing to go and get into the habit of understanding that it's not just about forming new teams and going and breaking teams apart and stuff like this, but actually rotating people through different areas of the system, right? Or basically going and at least having the value of doing that, people can make their own choices about where to work in particular times in the system. Yeah, very valuable thing. It's like I have so often visited organizations where they basically have this notion that once you've gelled a team very well, you're done. It's kind of like these people at this table, they've worked together for the past year, they know how to get things done, right? Forming, norming, storming, they have the whole thing down. But you get baked in sometimes. You need to see other things. You need to expand your skill set. And if we have the ability to go and reteam effectively, we can do this, and we can start to go and think about skill allocation things. I remember years ago, there was like this big fight in the industry about feature teams and component teams, and there was a lot of talk about these things. And still, that conversation, that debate still continues in some segments of the industry. But one thing that many people arrived at was the notion that feature teams are better, right? If you have a team and you can say to them, okay, well, you are a gelled team, and we're going to give you these stories and these stories and these stories and these stories, and you get to touch any place in the code that you want to in order to go and actually do these things. It can work out okay, but the thing is you can also end up being in this tragedy of the commons situation, being in a situation where basically nobody really feels enough ownership to go and sort of like make the proper decisions in order to go and move things effectively. And quite often, this is not a matter of people being lazy or malicious. It's just the cognitive situation of dealing with different areas of the system all the time and not really specializing. So the thing I typically say to teams is like, you can have feature teams and component teams and product teams, teams focused around a particular domain. You can do all these things in order to go and optimize your development, but these are decisions you continually revisit. And you continually revisit who's on these teams in order to go and get the skill set exactly where we want it to be. We've said people over process for over a decade now in this industry, in Agile, right? But still there's the notion of like, okay, well, I just need a QA person here. I just need a UX person here, right? People have different skill sets, and you can work with them for their career growth and also for the growth of your system, being able to attend it very well. And here's I think the last one I've got. System as stakeholder. This is a strange idea. I remember talking to some friends a while back, and they were talking to me about something called actor network theory, okay, which is essentially a branch of social system sociology by a guy named Bruno Latour, a Frenchman named Bruno Latour. And a friend of mine who was telling me about this said that it's kind of fascinating because you try to look at systems from the point of view that there are these inanimate objects and there are the people involved, and they're the same. They're basically co-equal in a way, right? So the example that he basically used in the early extreme programming days was like, okay, you have index cards, right, that you use for story planning and all these other things, and you have people on the team, and it's like, the story cards are an actor in the system just like the people in the team are, right? And it's funny about this because we can do that same thing with our systems. Imagine doing this. Imagine having like a role-playing thing on your team where you anthropomorphize different parts of your system, right? So imagine stepping into the mindset of being, I am the data store for this persistent service, right? And it's like, okay, what I need right now is like, there's parts of me that are kind of grubby. I need this particular area to be cleaned up. I won't be able to go and handle these particular requests if I don't have these particular things. It's almost like a role-playing thing in a way. But going and sort of like getting ourselves to the point of going and recognizing that it's not just us, okay? It's not just teams. It's not just people. We basically exist in our companies in a symbiotic relationship with the technical systems that we have, right? And to the degree that we're blind to that, we're suboptimal, right? And we can make some decisions that are not based on full awareness. I'm sure you've seen this kind of thing happen where you make a particular technical decision, you have an area of the system which is really hard to go and modify, and as a result of that hardness to modify, you end up going and creating a new division around that system, and it actually impacts organizational structure, the intractability of your code, right? So it's not just a matter of us saying, hey, we've got stories, we've got features, we've got our team structure, we've got all this planning. These things that we have in our systems, these parts of our systems, are stakeholders as well. And we haven't really taken that view and kind of pushed it as far as we can in the industry yet. I think there's something there. I think it's really worthy of experimentation. So, yeah, I think this is a key one, tending the system. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's going to be tough for me to go and talk about this because I'm not against it, right? I think it's important for us to be happy at work, right? I think teams are vitally important, communication is vitally important, all these different things. But at the end of the day, we're producing value in our business and stuff like this, but we're also caretakers in a way, right? We are caretaking these systems that we have under our control. We're caretaking these systems that we've actually created, right? The things that we do now are going to impact our long-term health. And the long-term health of particular areas of our code are going to impact the long-term health of our organization, right? But we haven't really cultivated this point of view yet, I don't think, in the industry. If you're a caretaker, you take a different vision of things, okay? You make sure that everybody understands enough about the architecture to basically know what the impacts are. And you're thinking about what's going to happen 6 months from now and a year from now if you make bad decisions. And that doesn't mean that we can't go ahead and sort of push forward and do all the emergent design stuff we've been doing for quite a while in the industry. We can, but basically visibility and awareness are quite vital, okay? And we just have to do what it takes to go and basically keep these systems healthy. That's our job, right? Not just developers, product people too. Everybody who's involved, because we are becoming very, very software intensive. Not just what we call traditionally the software industry, but all businesses now are getting in that space. So it's an obligatory symbiosis picture, right? Okay. Where's Nemo, right? Okay, so. Yeah, there's a symbiotic relationship between clownfish and sea anemone. I forget the details exactly, but I think the way the skin is on the fish is such that they can't be stung. I forget the details. You can look it up if you want to, but this happens in nature all the time, right? And we just have to realize that we are in this symbiotic relationship with our technical systems and behave appropriately. So that's what we wanted to say. Software shapes business. Shape of our software is vital information.